This audio recording is to address the concept of late effect diagnoses, and this is starting on page 60 of your AHA coding handbook. And by definition, a late effect is a residual condition that remains or appears after the end of an acute phase of an illness or injury. This residual condition can occur at any time after the acute phase, so it can be present right away, or it can not show up till some time after. So a couple of examples of that might be a patient had a cerebrovascular accident and is left with hemiparesis or hemiplegia on one side of their body. Okay. The CVA is taken care of or over with after the first hospital stay. That is a cerebrovascular accident, or you might call it a stroke. So the acute phase is over after discharge from the hospital, but the patient is left with the late effect of hemiplegia or hemiparesis. Okay, another example in your exercise 7.5 is patient suffered a fracture of finger, and that fracture has healed, but the patient is left with a bent or contracture in one of the joints of the phalange. So the acute phase of the fracture, when that is over, the leftover contracture becomes the late effect. Okay. Another one could be a patient had polio and they are left with a gait disturbance. Okay. Could even be something like exposure to asbestos and then ends up with mesothelioma. You hear about that as well on TV. So that's what a late effect is, and one of the keys to it is the acute phase of the original illness or injury has to be over with. So if it's a fracture, that fracture treatment has to be over with. While that patient is being treated with a fracture, cast changes, x-rays, splinting, maybe surgery isn't done till after the swelling is down. We're all still in the acute phase when treatment of the fracture is going on. But once the treatment has concluded, if there's a residual, that residual is the late effect. And generally speaking, when you code late effect situations, you're going to have two codes. Okay, and this is discussed on page 61. Your first code is going to be actually what is that residual? Okay. And then what is the code of the illness or injury that has concluded or the acute phase is over? And generally that late effect code of the condition that is over with, you don't code it as if it's current. You code it as a cause of the residual. And the characters in the cause of a residual are somewhat different than as if that were in the acute phase. So if we look down at a couple examples on page 61, it says post-traumatic osteoarthritis of the right shoulder due to old fracture of right humerus. So the first code listed, the M19, is the post-traumatic osteoarthritis of the right shoulder. We would look that code up by looking at osteoarthritis, and then we're going to look for post-traumatic, and then we'll look for the shoulder. The second code, the S42, is actually coding the fracture of the right humerus, but then the last character is S for sequela, meaning that that caused the osteoarthritis. The next example here, we have paralysis of a leg due to old polio. So the first code, G83, is paralysis of a leg, and you're going to look that up by going to paralysis and then looking for leg or limb. And then the B91 is actually looking at history of polio or going to polio and then looking for history of or old or resolved. And then the third example is adrenal TB calcification. So what this diagnosis means is that the patient did have TB that affected the adrenal glands. So, and our key to identifying this as a late effect is the term calcification. A calcification is not an acute situation. That's something that has built up over time. So we're going to look for our B90.8, which would be calcification of the adrenal gland, and then E35 would be under tuberculosis, old or history of tuberculosis. Now, I would, if I were you, go through these three examples, try to code them out, and arrive at the correct codes. Following these examples on page 61, there are three exceptions to requires two codes for late effects. And you're going to want to read through these exceptions. Sometimes the residual effect is not stated, or the cause of the late effect is used alone. An example of this exception, if you go to the exercises on page 62 and 63, you're going to see in number 1 on exercise 7.6 it says residuals of poliomyelitis. Well, we know that they had polio in the past, but we don't know what the residuals are, so we are only able to code the sequela of poliomyelitis. And that brings me to the point of the main term sequela, S-E-Q-U-E-L-A-E, is a main term. And underneath this is where you can find a lot of the acute conditions and injuries that are now over with. So main term sequela, and then look for poliomyelitis. And you're going to get B91. Going back to the three exceptions, so that was an example of the first bullet. The second bullet says when no late effect code is provided but the condition is described as being a late effect, only the residual condition is coded. Note that conditions described due to a previous surgery are not late effects, but are either history ofs or complications, depending on the situation. And both of those will be addressed in later chapters. So let's look at an example of the second bullet. When no late effect code is provided, but the condition is described as being a late effect. Let's see which one gives us that example here. We don't have an example on the next page of that. But it would sort of be the opposite of number 1 or number 2. You know what the residual is, but you don't know what the originating illness or injury was. And then the third bullet, back on the bottom of page 61, is the one that's probably used most commonly, is the late effect code has been expanded at the 4th, 5th, or 6th character to include the manifestation condition, that is the residual, and the cause of that. So an example of this they give as cognitive deficits following non-traumatic subarachnoid hemorrhage. The I-69.01 includes what the residual is, that is the cognitive deficits, and it also includes what the original injury was, and that was a subarachnoid hemorrhage. Let's look at a couple other examples for this bullet on the following 2 pages. So if we look at exercise 7.6 again, number 3, it says stroke 2 years ago with residual hemiplegia of the right dominant side. So we're going to go under sequela as our main term, and then we are going to look for stroke or cerebrovascular disease with hemiplegia, right dominant side, and we're going to end up with one code, That is I-69.35. That describes what the originating condition was and the residual condition, which is the hemiplegia. If we go down to in exercise 7.7, number 4, we have flaccid hemiplegia due to old cerebral infarction. So again, we can go to sequelous cerebral infarction and then find the hemiplegia and end up with I-69.359. These answers are posted in E360 as well. Some of the codes that will have two, or let's go through some of the problems that will have two codes. If we look at exercise 7.7, number 3, we have brain damage following cerebral abscess 7 months ago. So our first code is going to be for brain damage. Main term is damage, then go to brain, and we end up with your first code. Answers are posted on E360. Your second code for number 3 is sequela of an abscess in the cerebrum. Okay. If we skip down to number 5, we have bilateral neurodeafness resulting from childhood measles. So our residual condition is the neurodeafness. So deafness is our main term. Then we go to neuro, bilateral, and we get our first code. And then our measles, we can go to sequela, measles, and we get our second code. What's the residual condition is the first code. What's the condition that's over with is the second code. And this ends the description of late effects. Again, you might want to mark these pages to reference when you complete your assignment or come across late effects later in the course. The one thing I can tell you about late effects is when a chart comes across your desk to code or comes up in your computer queue to code, it isn't going to say that this is a late effect. You're going to read the chart and you're going to have to realize, hey, this acute phase is over with, we're dealing with residuals now, this is late effect coding, and this is the procedure that I follow for that. This ends the recording on late effects.